any student events coming up? How did our timber sports competition go this past weekend? I'm pretty sure I was right behind one of the forestry vans coming back from that. Was anybody there?
I think they shared something that they got like high up placed. I don't remember what it was, but it was like a decent place.
Cool.
I heard they won.
They might have got first place. That's why I'm like, I don't remember exactly, but I remember seeing they placed pretty high.
All right. Good deal. If you are not able to make the field trip, there is an alternative assignment. Basically, go for ideally a weekend and do something like what we would do for the field trip. So in our case, it's a canoe trip. In your case, it might be a backpacking trip, climbing trip, something like that. And take a bunch of photos or short video clips. And for each of those, you would take a second to caption each one of those with like a sentence or two. And just kind of let me know what I'm looking at. So take a picture of vegetation getting trampled like we're talking about today, or a management effort like a coping line or fence or something like that, scree wall, to prevent vegetation from getting trampled in a more fragile, like a high angle or subalpine area, something like that. And just as long as you're tying stuff that you're seeing while you're out there to anything that we have talked about or might be talking about in class, that's enough reassurance for me that you're kind of getting what we're going for on our field trip, even if you're not able to make it. So sometime during the semester, head out, do your trip in parallel with ours or what have you, and then before the end of the semester, send me that document, or you can throw together like a YouTube video or something if you prefer video clips. It's pretty easy to edit together short clips into something like that, and that's good enough. Okay? Cool. Any questions about the alternative field trip option for anybody who can't make it for canoeing or kayaking? All right, good deal. In that case, how are we doing on meal planning for our various groups? Has everybody had a chance to go through and read the fine print on the ingredients list? Make sure there's no peanut dust in there. Yes. All right, cool. That's one detail we can't really slip on. But other than that, going okay? Awesome. We'll have some time at the end of the class, hopefully, to get back together in groups and just kind of move the ball forward with details that tend to fall through the cracks until the last second, like what spices, who is bringing each thing, so it doesn't all sort of land on us in a couple of weeks when we head out to Ozark Scenic Riverways. In the meantime, let's pick up our narrative where we left off last time. We were talking about water resources and what those are, how people tend to value those or use them, and in some cases negatively impact those water resources as a function of recreation, very occasionally as a function of recreation management, where the manager is actually allowing something negative or impactful in a bad way to happen. And we are up to the point of vegetation. In our forestry department, this is what, like week 4 of classes, and we're finally talking about plants. So here we go. This, along with the other previous classes of resources, have the PowerPoints and stuff like that on the course website and stuff like that. But because this is a forestry program and we're now sort of solidly into the resource discussion part of the class, this is a good chance to actually go through this one a little bit slower and a little bit more detail than a couple of the past ones, because this is kind of our bread and butter here in forestry. Although to be a park ranger, you also need to, of course, keep in mind stuff like terrain, topography, katabatic airflow, water quality, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's run through some vegetation as resource in Forest Rec, and then we'll get into kind of the other stages of this discussion, either today or on Wednesday. So with Forest Rec, the plants are often a big and visible part of the reason, the motivation that people have for showing up to your park or protected area. And we can tell that these are important because of how we manage vegetation resources. Like, we are not going to this level of effort over boulders, for the most part. We're not going to this level of effort to move water around in most parks and protected areas. But for living organisms, yeah, we're absolutely doing stuff like this. So we're going to talk about things like, what are the extrema of the range that vegetation species occupy? What are some of the largest organisms? What are some of the rarest organisms? What are the organisms that are present that shouldn't be present? Non-native species, and so forth. Okay? But to start things off, we're just talking about what are the characteristics of vegetation that we sort of see as resources, right? So sometimes we have species that are a little bit more interactive, like a pitcher plant or Venus flytrap, or so on and so forth. People see this as interesting, right? So if you've never been to like a cranberry bog in the American Northeast, which is extremely, extremely nutrient limited, with extremely acidified water around pH 4.0, to the point that in order for the plants to survive, they need to be carnivorous in many cases. Pitcher plants, Venus flytraps, stuff like this. Because that's unusual, because that seems like a novel stimulus to our mammalian brains, people seek this stuff out and will go hiking to stuff like this. But the problem is, Venus flytraps in their native habitat are on mats of peat bog moss material. And that peat can grow in mats 10, 20 feet thick. And it's like walking on a trampoline, but it's also really kind of dangerous because some people who aren't strong swimmers can accidentally, if they're not wearing what are called bog shoes, they're kind of like snowshoes to spread out the pressure and the weight of your foot across more space. You don't punch through that peat moss mat. You can punch right through and fall into this acidic water and be kind of constrained by it all around you. It might be a column 10 or 15 feet thick, and it can be more difficult for some people with lowered mobility or low swimming skill to swim out of that. So we are adding bodies to these peat bogs. But the idea is pretty clear, right? So this is a weird looking plant, and weird and rare plants, exotic seeming plants to us, even if they're local and native, they're a draw, they're a reason, they're a motivation for people to come to recreation areas and to trample the very vegetation they've come to see in their excitement of seeing that vegetation. Okay? So at the end of this section, we'll talk about some management techniques around vegetation, how to protect it for and provide it at the same time for wildlife use or for recreational use. But we just gotta understand that plants have values associated with them, human values. So we've got low angle or oblique power hour sunset photography here through some seeded out grasses. Is this an ugly scene or is this a beautiful scene? What do you think? Yeah, it's up there on the level of like stock photograph. If you took a photo like this, you could sell it to somebody and they could publish it, and presumably they'd make some money on it too. So, because just even grasses at the right time of day have an aesthetic value, we want to not commit so-called pattern blindness mistakes. That is, you and I see grass every single day, and we stop seeing it as an aesthetic thing because we see it every day. Whereas somebody who's coming into your wildlife refuge or your national park or something like that from an area that doesn't have those particular, even just grass species, they can pull off on the side of the highway going through your park as they're driving maybe from the visitor center to the big campground or whatever, and kind of wander into a field of this stuff, and maybe somebody else sees you doing that or sees them doing that, and so they pull off too, and all of a sudden we don't even have an elk jam or a bear jam, we have a grass jam. People are wandering back and forth and trampling that vegetation, creating some pressure on it, all because it's pretty, or all because it's maybe not even that pretty, but it's just new to them. Okay? We are novelty-seeking organisms. We think things that are new are more exciting, possibly more desirable, stuff like that. So, because we are also dealing with the human wildlife species in this class, we're talking about what can be just as common as normal to us as grass that we don't even see or think about anymore, but we have to manage as if it were an exotic, exciting species, because to some people it is an exciting species. Okay? Now, sometimes we do actually have legit endangered species. So this is the ahina. It's the silver sword plant. Grows on Haleakala's upper slopes, and there are just a couple of species of this stuff. And this particular species, or subspecies, it's actually a genetically unique subpopulation. It only grows in a narrow elevation band at the top of the dry side. This is the looks like surface of Mars side. Gets a couple of centimeters of precip a year. Section of Haleakala cinder cone, and nowhere else on the planet. So that's super rare. There's a couple 100,000 individual organisms total. Yes, they can count every single one because there are so few. All right, so you get a nice detailed aerial photograph, count the number of silvery green pixels. That's it. Okay, so the root hairs on these extend 5-6 feet out past each one. This is a very shallow radial rooting instead of a taproot rooted species. And so you get these real fine root runners, really the size of root hairs on other organisms. And it's very shallow. It's just under that first individual layer of cinder grains, sand grains. Because it's only getting a couple of centimeters of rain per year, and it's got to send out those roots real close to the surface to get any of that actual precip that comes down. Now, more commonly, what's happening is it's harvesting precip in the sense that this is actually a cloud desert more than it is a true high desert. So as cloud droplets blow across the very fine cilia-like hairs covering this thing, this is actually a normal green color underneath, but it's got such sort of a furry surface texture to it that those cloud droplets get sort of intercepted or grabbed by those hydrophilic hairs and channel the water toward the central stalk, and it basically causes the cloud to rain on itself as an individual organism. This is a very, very marginal, borderline, edge of habitability survival strategy. And what this means is if you walk within 4 or 5 feet of the ahina, you are killing its root hairs with every step, because they are the fineness and the texture and the shatter or shear resistance of hair, basically, which is to say you can't have somebody step on it and keep it intact. But it doesn't look like it. And so people, sometimes knowing that this is an extremely rare plant, will kill it in their efforts to protect it as uneducated recreationists or low-skill habitat restoration folks. So there are a lot of examples of people who have put rings of rocks around these and completely killed the plant by the following season because they were stepping all over the plant and amputating its roots with each step as they were placing the rocks to protect it so that nobody else would step on the ahina, right? So sometimes our management is going to be to not tell people how fragile something is, because that activates sometimes a very harmful behavior in a misguided effort to protect something that's super fragile. Yeah, question?
I also wanted to say something that we learned when we were up in like the high desert on Big Island of Hawaii, was we were always told not to stack rocks.
Yes.
Because then, I forget what field of study of science, but like they think it might have been like historic Hawaiian burial site services.
Yes.
Spent a whole bunch of money trying to figure out, okay, why were these rocks stacked here?
Yep.
And like, you know, they're going to spend thousands of dollars to find out it was just some dumb PFC that stacked rock when we was forward.
Exactly.
So it's like the tourists not knowing not to stack rocks might just do it for fun.
Yeah, so this is a thing right here as well, like within the field of this particular photograph too. The ahina hina is very significant as a plant symbolically for Native Hawaiian royalty. Like when their kings and queens would have, or their monarchs would have, like religious rites or civic festivals like parades, their equivalent of parades. Part of their ceremonial garb, or like the things they were carrying or that were brought along with them, were individual specimens of this, that individuals of that society had climbed this 10,000 foot volcano and brought those individual specimens back down. And in the lava tubes just over this ridge and sort of down in the crater valley there, you can't see them very well in this photo, a bunch of those Hawaiian royalty or their remains are interred or buried. And so the Native Hawaiians had been burying folks up there for centuries. And then backpackers show up and get after some of those remains. We'll talk more about those kinds of things in the human resources category. So archaeological remains and human remains in particular are very sensitive. But just the short version is that some people think it'd be really cool. What if I found the pinky bone of King so-and-so? So let me go explore this lava tube and take a relic back, and I'll stick it on my mantle shelf over the fireplace and go, gee whiz, what a nice trip that was. Totally desecrating. This would be like some idiot tourist from Altoona, going to Jesus's tomb in Israel and like coming back with a finger bone they find or something like that. It's probably not the real thing, but why would you have people do that? Anyway, so the Endangered Species Act makes it very clear that where there are exceptionally threatened, so rare, threatened, or endangered species in that order, the protections necessarily or mandatorily have to ramp way up. And we tend to think of the Endangered Species Act as the Endangered Wildlife Act, but as it turns out, plant species, of course, arthropod species, so like isopods, amphipods, little shrimp-like insects, basically, those qualify too. And increasingly these days, rare, threatened, and endangered biotic communities, not just an individual species, but the whole sort of micro ecosystem around them, those can be protected and listed as well. So this is a big deal, and these resources are, where they are rare, threatened, or endangered, that imputes to a lot of your visitors, oh, this is exciting because this is the only place on Earth where I can see this plant. And it might be just a 30-second, how neat is that, honey? Did you get a cell phone photo of it? Good, okay, let's go get corn dogs. It might be that kind of an experience, but for some people, this is the point. And the vistas are nice and stuff like that, but the spiritual value, the experiential value is here with this. So, we got to pay a lot of attention to RT&Es as they're called. All right, we also have a whole bunch of trees to think about. And there's not sound attached to this video clip right now, but if you kind of focus on this for a sec, can you hear the sound of the wind in this grove or this stand of pine? What does that sound like to you? What's that sound like in your head? Okay, we would call that white noise or pink noise, depending on the frequency distribution. So just that kind of soft rushing sound, as it turns out, has profound effects on your physiology and mine. And it changes things like our blood pressure, serum concentration of things like cortisol, stress response hormone, and so on and so forth. So the fact that these trees, in this case, are pairing with the aerophony, or the geophony, that is the non-living, air-based sound of an environment, and they are generating a lot of that sound as the wind goes through those needles, these plants are directly creating a whole other class of resource that is the local soundscape. Okay? So, even when it's just like ratchet, basic, common stand of pine, for example, part of the value, part of the resource is what sounds are these contributing? And we'll have the same discussion coming up here with wildlife, of course. You need to hear bird song and elk bugling during mating season and all sorts of stuff. But we don't want to forget that plants are making a lot of sounds. And they are also ablating, that is, absorbing negative or harmful sounds, what we will call noise. Okay? So, we want to keep that in mind as well. We want to think about the non-continuous nature of a lot of the sort of recreation value ascribed to vegetation. So twice now on summer camp when we've gone west, we managed to time it with desert super blooms. This past summer was one of those. And those are fairly rare. Every 5 years, every 10 years, every 25 years, depending on the local regime and just random chance, or larger scale climate cycles, you can be driving across a brown and dead looking wasteland to the uninitiated, and then after a year with a little bit more rain during the winter monsoon season, it can be carpeted wall to wall for miles continuously across that same desert floor with desert wildflowers. Okay? So, when that happens, and it is rare for it to happen, we get all sorts of other species that are dependent on that. They also go into overdrive mode as well. So it completely changes what's going on. We don't want to think of these resources too abstractly, too far removed from what is the status of desert superbloom this year versus, okay, well, we're in pinyon juniper or maybe lower elevation, we're down in black sagebrush country, and it's just going to look kind of sandy or brown or sort of that gray-green, that sage-green color. It's not like that all the time. And when it is not like that, we get a whole bunch of associated visitor impacts as well as exploding biological activity to take advantage of these rare events. Some, like the ahina or yucca or agave. If we go back to the silver sword real quick, this puts up a single fruiting body, its sexual reproductive stalk, once every 10 to 25 years. It takes that long for it to gather the resources necessary to do that, the nutrients, the embodied sunlight and so forth, and it sends up this 2, 3, 4 foot long sort of woody stalk. And then if something happens to that stalk, that plant might not get another chance to reproduce for 25 years. Okay? So it's like in humans where we have a sky-high miscarriage rate. 30 to 40% of human pregnancies don't make it to term. Separately and independent of things like abortion procedures or life-saving surgeries, stuff like that. This is a problem because that sword of the silver sword, that reproductive stalk, is just about the perfect size for human children to reach in, break it off, and have an actual sword fight. And it screws this entire species in that local area because they've also stepped on the root hairs to reach in and grab it, right? So that's a real problem. And we all certainly understand the motivation to sword fight. I mean, how many billions of dollars has the Star Wars franchise brought in since, 1978 or 77? Because people like sword fighting, right? That's never not going to be a thing, but sometimes the normal reproductive cycling of some of these wildlife species, or plant species in this case, just looks too appealing, and they're sword fighting with effectively the phalluses of the plant. It's sort of ironic in that way. With the nature of why we tend to, as societies, set aside parks for outstanding, rare, unique specimens or conditions. We tend to protect champion individual organisms like that. This is from, I think, Howl's Moving Castle or whatever. One of the old Miyazaki films. Anyway, we ascribe special value to uniquely large or uniquely old, the oldest of something. It doesn't matter how old or how big the second biggest or oldest one is. We care about number one, the big one. Okay? So, if you look really closely and you have pretty recently calibrated prescription on your eyeglasses, you can see how big or small, relatively speaking, the people are. This guy is 6 pixels tall in a full-size image. Okay. There is specific recreation value ascribed to even just walking around trees of this size. Now, this next image is a forced perspective, sort of fisheye image, but you get the idea here, right? Some of these things are 25, 30 feet in circumference or more, maybe 15 or 20, 25 feet in diameter, right? So it's different. Has anybody in this class ever been to Muir Woods out in California? Muir Woods. So it's an area that is absolutely surrounded by urban sprawl. But walking around in here, people have described to the National Park Service in terms of things like, what's your subjective sensation of walking among organisms that are older than Jesus by hundreds of years and so forth? What does that feel like to you as a recreation experience? And the things that people describe going through not just their heads, but their bodies and their hearts and their spirits, they tend to use religious or spiritual or transcendent terms, describing as this is the exact same sensation as walking into a 1,000-year-old cathedral or Japanese Shinto temple. Might be 12 or 1,500 years old or whatever. But this is even better. Because of the scale, the verticality, the silence or the natural quiet around it. These aren't just organisms. They are powerfully affective symbols for us as well. Okay? So, the Park Service here, in places like Muir Woods, they bend over backwards to help people behave in a way that doesn't impact other people's experience around these organisms. In the same way that people have kind of a behavioral norm of there's a certain way you behave in your church or your synagogue or your mosque or your meditation retreat center, right? People's posture is different. You walk differently. You speak much lower and more respectfully. You tend not to joke around as much. Well, the Park Service is seeing most visitors do exactly those things in a very natural environment where there are no buildings or religious symbols around. Okay? No human-made religious symbols. For some people, this is very much a religious symbol. All right, so we also want to think about these trees and our other classes of resources, our other vegetative species within this class of resource, as not just interesting and attractive, meaning part of the motivation is attracting people to visiting these things, but they are contributing to supporting and driving the ecosystem services all around them. So we have vegetation resources in timber and non-timber forest products. But we don't do timber forest products in parks. Why not, do you think? Why don't we have timber extraction at Ozark National Scenic Riverways, or Grand Teton National Park, or Yellowstone? There's some pretty amazing trees in there, and, it's not going to collapse the ecosystem if we pull a few logs out. Why don't we do that in parks? But we do it in all of the national forests typically surrounding each national park. Michael.
The national parks kind of subscribe to more like Muir's philosophy when managing land versus national forests being more sustainable rather than being environmental. So then they put more value on like the recreational and visible value rather than the economic value.
Yeah. So existential value, aesthetic value, ecosystem services value. Part of the sense of what it means to be a preservation-led organization instead of a conservation-led organization is we have other trees for things like, in this case, paper making. We have lots of other trees for that, and we can manage those stands to be really efficient and long-term sustainable, like on Centuries, sustainable, good to go. But not all places can handle that, and the places that can't tend to intersect a lot with places we set aside as parks. That is, some places are going to be wasted for just material production values, okay? So, we don't do that. All right, let's see. Other ecosystem services that your vegetation resources in your park as live organisms and so forth, they're going to contribute things like ablating energy. That is, rainfall on a newly burned, or catastrophically burned in particular, wildland fire slope can cause mudslides. It can cause major soil degradation and so forth and so on. But if that is a forested slope or even just like thatchy, thicket ground cover like thick grasses, tufted grasses, or shrub and brush type growth forms, with the same storm on the same slope, you don't get catastrophic, in some cases deadly landslides or floods. You get nicely infiltrating water. It holds the soil in place with the roots and absorbs that kinetic energy just fine. So this has the knock-on effect a little bit downstream or downslope of moderating the hydrograph. That is, you don't get a peak flow event because it's not all overland flow. All of the dead down matter for those plant organisms is helping to slow that flow enough that you get more infiltration. And some of the water is adsorbed onto the surface area of dead down matter like leaves and humus and so forth. Okay? So, this is a good thing. This works out well for us and is a very important thing. If you want to think of the ability of grasses, graminoids, sedges, bamboos, reeds, stuff like that, to the extent that they can prostrate, that is, when you step on it, the blades of grass lay flat, and then when you lift your foot, over time they spring back up, and nothing's been injured. That's called prostration, the ability to lay down and spring back up. That is an ecosystem service. This is also why we cover things like our disc golfing course. We cover soccer, European football pitches or fields with grasses, because they're relatively resistant to human trampling, human tracking, that is, creating tracks in those particular ecosystems. So I got to do an informal study of forested trails where we just put out a whole bunch of grass seed on these sort of dirt surface trails post-construction, and then ran a whole bunch of traffic across them. And as it turns out, even in a heavily shaded forest, like full canopy cover environment, if there's grass there, you get a tiny fraction of the soil erosion that you normally get with a soil surface trail. We did find a bit of a trade-off. When that grass is wet, that trail is very slippery, so it's not the right tool for every thing, and we're never going to see grassed over trails the whole time, but that's a very good thing. The problem is with non-native invasive grasses we'll get into in a bit. those on trails are a huge problem. Okay, so veg cover is helping to create a soundscape. It is also helping to filter out the anthropogenic, the human-originated, negatively evaluated sounds that we call noise. Noise pollution, that is a real thing. And these leaves are also helping filter out absolutely crazy amounts of plastic dust, diesel dust, aeolian soil transport, right? That wind hits the air filter of miles and miles of surface area of leaves and slows down, and it drops those particles. So, very, very, very important stuff. Trees are cleaning your air for your visitors as well. Okay? And also, we have vegetation mats, lower growing herbaceous stuff that can survive, or at least hang on for dear life, at the alpine transition zone, where trees are not able to get up past the crumholes area. And this is the stuff that is both generating more soil and holding what soil is in place there so that it doesn't completely take over all of your valleys every time it rains. If you look in the cinematograph, which is a video where most of the video is frozen, you have one moving element, this is actually really pretty clear water, even though there's a whole bunch of exposed soil up watershed from this spot. Does that make sense? That's all because of this stuff right here. Otherwise, we're looking at like chalk gray milk streams. Okay? So we also want to sort of mention that vegetation is also not just plants. For the purposes of this class, we're going to include fungi, cyanobacteria, and so forth. All of these, we're going to call them plants. All right? But they are not technically, so don't sue me. They are absolutely critical to our survival and nutrient cycling. And as we'll talk about in the climate section of the class, it's actually fungi that keep recreation ecologists and epidemiologists awake at night. As things are warming up, we're seeing tropical fungi that we are not ready for starting to migrate north. With sporulation, it is so easy to move fungi around, with each of these producing typically up to millions of spores per puff. And if you think antibiotic resistance is rough, consider that we only have a few effective antifungal medications total, and they have a fairly narrow, safe dosage range. So it is entirely likely that within our lifetimes we will experience some sort of a global pandemic that is fungal in nature, not viral. Okay, so just throwing that out there. And in parks and protected areas, we have the tools to find this stuff, to monitor the spread, to be a reference point ecologically to understand that this fungi doesn't belong here, and we're starting to see it here now as things warm up. So, that's a thing. We want to consider vegetation as habitat as well. These are snails at Great Smoky Mountains National Park on tree bark. And we have all sorts of butterflies, for example, that are obligated to very specific, not just habitats, but individual tree species that they need to have. And for some species of butterflies, for example, they have to have old growth stands of specific oak species, or they're just going to die out. And so part of your wildlife management is managing the vegetation species as a resource. Okay? Obviously, we all know about the wildlife value of snags, that is standing dead trees, for our larger mobile species. Motile is the same thing as mobile. So, all of this said, if we get the vegetation right, it's going to help protect the soils. It's going to help clean up the water quality, the air quality, the soundscape quality. And cleaning up air quality means you are necessarily cleaning up dark skies quality. We'll talk about that later. It's going to have crack-on effects for everything. So this is why we're spending a little bit more time and focus on this than kind of skipping through fairly rapidly on some of the other classes or resources. So we gotta get the vegetation right. And we'll see, unfortunately, that human beings have figured out just about every possible conceivable way to impact our vegetation species pretty hard. So we want to keep an eye on those glades, which are like partially open meadows. We want to understand that we can't necessarily breed up our key wildlife species, especially the bigger and more mobile they are, the more expensive that gets. And sometimes it just outstrips our ability, even as a federal organization with the National Park Service, to sustain larger population levels for larger species of wildlife. What we can do is make sure that they have extremely high quality habitat, and that's mostly a vegetation management effort. Okay, so for those of you who are WAMCON students, like, this is kind of why we are going so hard on habitat management instead of individual organism management. It doesn't matter how well we are managing whitetail here in Illinois or something like that. If their habitat isn't in place, we're effectively zoo farming them. So we're not going to really even try to do that. Okay? So, any questions about the vegetation class of resources? All right, cool. If not, let's get into impacts next. This is unfortunately a big chunky section, so here we go.